All right, let's dive right in. We're going to tackle a huge question today, one that gets to the very core of how societies work. Why is it that some social hierarchies, the kind you're born into, just fade away, while others seem to last forever? Let's get into it.
You hear this all the time, right? It's this powerful idea that caste is a phenomenon you only find in India. But what if that idea, as common as it is actually hiding a much bigger, much more global story?
And yeah, that's the whole argument of the source material we're digging into today. The idea that caste is some one-of-a-kind thing is, well, just a profound misunderstanding of how human societies have worked all over the world.
So why does this myth have such a powerful hold on us? It's kind of like a double-edged sword. For the rest of the world, it makes Indian society seem exotic and different. But for people inside the system, it can make caste feel like this unchangeable part of their culture, not what it actually is, a system built by people.
And this really gets us to the heart of it. The source material argues that these kinds of hereditary hierarchies, they aren't some rare thing in history. Actually, they were practically the norm. So the real puzzle isn't why they existed. The real question is why some of them disappeared, while others are still with us.
Okay, so let's take a quick trip around the globe, because once you start looking, you see these systems everywhere. And the pattern that shows up is, honestly, it's pretty striking.
Let's start in East Asia. You had groups like the Bureaucracy in Japan and the Baekjeong in Korea. For centuries, they were pushed to the margins. And if you look at the slide, you'll see their stigma wasn't about religion. It was about their jobs, unclean work like handling leather or butchering animals.
And this wasn't just an Asian thing, not by a long shot. You go to parts of Africa and you find the Osu, a class of outcasts. Or get this, in Europe, you had the Cagots in France and Spain. For hundreds of years, they were kept separate, forced to use their own church entrances, their own water fountains, all because of the family they were born into. So here's the really big takeaway from all these examples. You don't actually need sacred texts or formal laws to keep these systems going. All it takes is a powerful social memory, just stories and attitudes passed down from one generation to the next to keep that stigma alive and well.
Which, of course, brings us to the central mystery. If societies from Japan to France to Nigeria all had their own version of this, then what gives? What separates their fates? Why are some of these divisions now just footnotes in history books, while others are still a very real part of modern life?
So now let's talk about how these things actually fall apart. How do these systems, which are so deeply embedded in a culture, finally start to unravel? Well, it turns out there's a pretty predictable pattern.
It usually happens in two stages. First, you get legal abolition. The government steps in and says, okay, discrimination is now illegal. That part's actually pretty quick. But stage two, that's the slow, messy, and really challenging part. The actual fading of prejudice out in the real world.
And to understand this next part, we need to grab onto a key concept from the source, something it calls administrative memory. This is what happens when the state itself keeps these identities alive by officially recording them and using them for things. Think of a census form that asks for your group, or laws that are tied to your ancestry.
So how does the stigma finally die? It's almost never because of some big moral awakening. Instead, it gets washed away by huge social changes. Think big cities, where nobody knows your family history. Mass migration, which just scrambles the old social map. And most importantly, when the state just stops officially recognizing the identity. The administrative memory fades. But what happens when that memory is kept alive on purpose?
And this is where the story of modern India takes a really sharp and honestly fascinating turn. Because while most of the world went down that path of just letting these identities erode, India started on a very different journey.
Just look at this table. It lays out the two paths so clearly. On one side, you have the path of erosion. The state basically becomes indifferent, it stops tracking the identity, and the stigma loses its power. But on the other side is the path of permanence, where the state, for its own policy reasons, actively preserves that identity, and in doing so accidentally keeps the stigma relevant. Now, it is absolutely crucial to get this next part right. This path was chosen for good reasons. The goal was to fix historical injustices using policies like affirmative action. But the source points out this huge paradox. By trying to fix the problem this way, these identities, instead of fading away with modernization, actually became more important, more politically charged.
This quote from the source material just perfectly sums up the whole argument, and let me read it again. What elsewhere decayed through neglect or rupture was here preserved through design.
Basically, these old divisions weren't just left behind, they were actively woven into the very machinery of the modern Indian state.
So, what's the big deal? What are the dangers of going down this path of permanence? Well, the source argues the risk isn't in admitting that a historical injustice happened. The risk is in trying to manage that injustice forever.
The problem, you see, is that this kind of permanent management freezes these identities in time. It takes a wound from history and turns it into a political tool that can be used over and over again, which makes it almost impossible for a society to ever really move on. It denies any chance of closure. So, when you look at the big sweep of history, it seems like these systems end in one of three ways. They either erode away with time and change, they get shattered by some huge crisis, like a war or revolution, or they stagnate, kept on life support through endless state management. And that third path, well, it might be the quietest, but it could also be the most damaging in the long run.
And this all leads us to the source's most powerful, most challenging conclusion. The reason this system has lasted so long is not because of some deep, unchangeable cultural flaw. It's the result of a whole series of choices, both administrative and political. It is a governing choice.
And that's really the profound question we're left with, isn't it? When you stop seeing these systems as some inevitable part of a culture and start seeing them as the result of deliberate choices, well, that changes everything. It forces you to ask, if these hierarchies were preserved by choice, is it possible that, by choice, they can also be unmade?